How-
and it's on the tip of my tongue. Neil Rolde.
All right. I'm going to show Neil, we're going to go backwards. We're going to go start at now and then go backwards.
Okay.
So what have you just done? What have you just finished?
All right, well, I have two books. One is a rewrite of a book I wrote 37 years ago. The first book I ever had published, which was a history of the town that we live in, town of York, Maine. And so that's going to be, we're going to try to get that out before Christmas. And then the other book is a book that I worked on for quite some time. It's a biography of a man who worked for the State Department during World War II. His name was Breckinridge Long, and he was very controversial. He was in charge, among other things, of the visa department, and many people call him an out-and-out anti-Semite who kept all the Jews out. I've read a lot of that in books about the Holocaust. But I didn't know anything.
Kept the Jews out of where?
What?
Kept the Jews out of where?
Out of coming to the United States.
Was it true?
Yes and no. If you were Albert Einstein, he'd let you in.
I see.
If you were Joe Schmutz, forget it. He was also, but it wasn't exclusively Jewish. It was Eastern Europeans. He was a friend of Franklin Roosevelt. That's how he got his job. They had been friends since they both worked for Woodrow Wilson in World War I. And but I found out that he had left a ton of papers at the National Library of Congress, and nobody had, and diaries, and nobody had gone through them really, except for the World War II period, and these started around 1916.
Oh.
And he was a very interesting guy. He ran for U.S. Senate a couple of times.
Out of curiosity, what was his ethnic makeup? What was his...
He was from the famous Breckinridge family.
Oh.
There was a family out of Kentucky. They were actually originally what they call Scots-Irish. They were Scots who went to Ireland. They were Protestants, and then they came over to this country. A lot of Americans have come from that area. Ulysses Grant, there's a whole bunch.
And is that why they know how to make really good whiskey?
What?
Is that why the Kentuckians know how to make good whiskey?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Because of the Irish background?
Oh yeah, absolutely. It was also the heart of the Whiskey Rebellion. James G. Blaine, who I wrote a biography of, who almost became president, he was of that group. Henry Clay. So there was a whole bunch of Andrew Jackson. These were all from that ethnic group. The Breckinridges were very prominent in Kentucky. His, I think it's his great uncle, was the Vice President of the United States with Franklin Pierce. And then he fled to the Confederacy, and he ended up as the Secretary of War of the Confederacy. And then had to flee the country after the Civil War was over. And finally was pardoned and came back.
Where did he flee to? Where did he flee to?
France, among other places. Because I have a thing in my book about Blaine where Blaine has gone to the opera, and he sees him below with his wife in a booth, and he feels very sorry for the guy, you know, because he was a very wealthy man, and apparently a very nice man, and apparently he came back and he fought the Ku Klux Klan after he came back to Kentucky. So anyway, that's...
So he had a kind of, he had a redo. He went 180 degrees.
Yeah, but the reason he went with the Confederacy was, I mean, that was, you know, the way he had been brought up, even though Kentucky actually never joined the Confederacy. But in any event, Long was from that family, and there were other distinguished members, but he was the most. John Cabell Breckinridge was his name, and so he had that on his, it was on his mother's side that he came from this very distinguished family. So he was always had a great ambition, to strive in politics and make a big name out of himself and so forth.
So he ended up being immigration in Washington?
Well, he ended up in the State Department as Assistant Secretary of State. There were 3 of them, and he had done that same job in World War I for Woodrow Wilson. And but he had a whole bunch of other things that he was connected with in the State Department, including helping get the UN started.
Right.
And
do you think the UN today, do you find that the UN today is superfluous? Because it feels to me the UN doesn't do as much or doesn't do what it's supposed to do. I feel like, for instance, Syria is a good opportunity for the UN to have stepped up and maybe, made peace, but I feel like the UN may be obsolete at this point.
Well, the UN has proved it can stop small conflagrations. It can't stop big ones, particularly where, in the case of Syria, where China and Russia, who are members of the Security Council, will not cooperate. So, it's like more than harder than herding cats to bring all these nations together. I don't think anybody foresaw that when the UN was set up. And it followed out from the League of Nations that Woodrow Wilson proposed the United States would not join.
Right.
So
anyway. Who were the countries in the League of Nations?
Well, just about everybody but us. But the major countries. Don't forget, that was a time of imperialism. So you didn't have all these little small countries in Africa and Asia and so forth. They were under the British or the French or the Portuguese, Spanish in a few instances.
So Neil, when you were in politics, you were a state representative for Maine?
Yeah.
And how many years?
16.
And would you say that it was fulfilling, or was it, why did you stop? I mean, you could still be a state representative if you wanted to do all the traveling.
Not really, because they put in term limits after I was gone.
I didn't know.
But in any event, there are ways to get around that. You can run for the Senate and then serve in the Senate. And then.
Did you see last night, did you see Romney's speech?
I can't stand that.
Did you watch it, though?
No.
So you didn't see the end? You didn't see Clint Eastwood implode?
No.
It was very good. We won't talk about that now.
Okay.
Okay, so your book. Let's go back to your book.
Yeah. So anyway, I found out there were all these papers and things. So I worked on getting a biography of him, because nobody's ever done a biography of him, of Breckinridge Long. At the same time, another part of the family was he married. He lived in St. Louis, Missouri. That's where he was born and brought up. His father was a cavalry officer in North Carolina, and but he married the granddaughter of a guy named Francis Blair. Now, you probably heard of Blair House in Washington. That was their home. Francis Blair, I think, was vice president of the United States, or he ran for vice president on the Democratic ticket. And he was the man who was credited with having kept Missouri in the Union.
Oh.
And so his granddaughter and his daughter were very special people in St. Louis. And so he married into that family, but she was an heiress, so he inherited a lot of money. So he used that to further his political ambitions. He ran for U.S. Senate twice, as I said, once as the Democratic candidate against the incumbent Republican, and he lost, and then he ran against a very anti-Wilson Democrat, and lost in the primary. But he, as I say, he became friends very good friends with Franklin Roosevelt. And so when Roosevelt was rising, he'd always been friends. He visited him after he had polio and everything like that. And they were very social, he and his wife and Eleanor and Frank.
Did he live in the area? Did he live in
He
upstate
moved to
New York?
Washington.
Oh, I see.
And so, they rented a big mansion. And so they were always entertaining. They had, in their house in St. Louis, they had an art gallery. She was very much into art and collecting porcelain and things like that. So anyway, they lived a very social life. And Roosevelt liked him. And so when Roosevelt was running, particularly in 1932, we forget that Roosevelt almost lost the Democratic nomination to Al Smith. I mean, he had worked for Al Smith 4 years before, and Al Smith had convinced him to become governor, or run for governor, and he became governor. And then he was his own man, and Al Smith couldn't stand that. And so they went at each other in 32. Breckinridge Long was one of the floor people at the convention for Roosevelt. And, and afterwards he began looking for some kind of political reward. And he didn't get it right away. And then Roosevelt needed a favor, which was to have somebody become the ambassador to Italy. And if you want to hear the whole story there, that's...
So who became the ambassador to Italy?
Yeah.
Who?
Breckinridge.
Oh, that's how he got it. Okay.
No, what happened was, do you know who James Michael Curley was?
It's funny. I know one of his descendants who just passed away,
really?
but I don't know who James Michael
was
Curley is, but I know James Curley.
Scapegrace mayor of Boston.
Right. Okay.
He went to jail. He was the last hurrah is about him.
Was he related to the Mellon family though, the Curleys?
No, he was an Irish.
Oh, this is a different.
Irish
this is a different one.
Catholic,
Okay.
Yeah. And he.
Carnegie? No.
No. This guy was
a crook.
Right off the boat from.
He had an accent. He was a potato.
He spoke with a brogue, and he was a charming guy, and so he had worked for Roosevelt. He was the only Irish politician in Massachusetts to support Roosevelt against Al Smith, who was an Irish Catholic. And so he wanted a reward, and he wanted to be ambassador to Italy. And there was this unspoken rule that the ambassador to Italy could not be a Catholic because he'd be too close to the Pope.
Right.
So Roosevelt was looking for a way to get out of this problem with Curley, and so he picked up the phone, called Breck Long. He said, "Would you be the ambassador to Italy?" Oh. And he went, and it was at a crucial time because Mussolini was the dictator of Italy, and it was at the time when Mussolini invaded Abyssinia and stuck his nose at the, thumbed his nose at the UN, or the League of Nations, and
supported Hitler, Hitler wasn't there yet. But
Hitler was on his way.
But they were rumblings, yeah.
He was already in power, but Mussolini was, had been in power since 1922. Hitler didn't come in until 1933. So Hitler was not ready to take on Mussolini, and Mussolini didn't want Hitler to take over Austria, so he got his troops on the border. But in any event, those were very hectic years to be ambassador to Italy. And he's got a lot in his book about it. And stuff that I haven't seen anywhere about the Roosevelt administration. And so then he got sick there. It turned out he had a stomach ulcer. And he went to the clinic up in Minnesota, the major clinic.
The Mayo Clinic?
Mayo Clinic. And he thought he had stomach cancer, but it turned out it was just an ulcer. And so he came back in time to work in the 36 campaign when Roosevelt was running for re-election. And as he had worked in the 32 one, once he got the nomination, he also did a lot of work for Roosevelt, running against Alf Landon. So, and then he got involved with the State Department again, and he always had this dream of becoming Secretary of State.
I see.
Yeah. And so in 1939, when the war broke out, they had a job for him. He had done a goodwill trip to South America for Roosevelt, and then he came back, and then the war broke out, and they gave him the job of bringing back all the Americans, even though we weren't at war.
Right.
And he did a very good job, apparently. I mean, he was a very hard worker. He was very attentive to details, but he was a bit of a crybaby and fairly difficult to work with. And so anyway, and then it became that there were all these refugees, and that had started around 1938 with Kristallnacht. You know what that is?
No.
Oh, well, Kristallnacht was when the Germans really went after the Jews in Germany. And they call it Kristallnacht because they broke all the windows of their businesses, and among other things, threw Karla's father into a concentration camp. And they jailed about 30,000 of the more prominent Jews, and then they let her father go, and at that time they just wanted to kick the Jews out.
The rich ones.
Well, they take their money and then kick them out, and which is exactly what they did. Well, my father-in-law wasn't planning to leave Germany. I mean, he was a German patriot. He fought in World War I. We have pictures, family pictures of he and his brothers-in-law. They're all wearing German uniforms, and so they finally got out. They went to Holland, and they got over to America. And otherwise, they would have ended up in
dust.
Well, not worse than Auschwitz. At least the wife and the 2 young children.
Yeah.
So anyway, that was Kristallnacht was sort of set off, and then but there were all these refugees, and we had these very restrictive immigration laws, which had been voted in 1924. Was
Roosevelt anti-Semite?
Well, see, some people try to say he was, but let me on one side you can say he appointed more Jews to cabinet position and to positions of power in his administration than any president before or since.
Right, okay. So that answers the question.
His closest assistants, I mean, the guy who wrote all the speeches was Sam Rosenman. I mean, there were and Henry Morgenthau Jr., who was his neighbor up in Dutchess County, New York, was made secretary.
I've been to his house there.
Have you been?
Yeah,
he
it's
was
beautiful.
Secretary of the Treasury.
Yeah.
And they were very close friends. And again, to talk about Long's anti-Semitism, he was very close friends with Bernard Baruch, who was a very noted, very wealthy, and very politically active Jew from South Carolina. So anyway, let's see, where was I?
So we were talking about the fact that maybe he was a little picky about who he allowed in.
Oh, very much so. He was following the laws, and the State Department had really pushed for these quotas. You know, where, like, say 100,000 Italians were coming in, it went down to, 15,000. The Greeks were down to about 2,000. And they put in these ethnic quotas, which is still, to a certain extent,
the same now.
Laws,
yeah.
Now.
Well, it's just like in Canada. You couldn't be a person of color. You couldn't be Native. You couldn't be Asian, and you couldn't be African American to buy land. And by the way, in Vancouver, it's still on some of the books.
Really? Yeah.
That they haven't removed it.
Well,
this is Canadian law.
That's the way this.
They don't acknowledge it, and
Yeah.
they don't,
Well, that's the way this country was. We also had a huge wave of anti-Semitism in this country, led by Henry Ford.
Right.
And, and that was the atmosphere I grew up in.
Right.
In Brookline, Mass., which was heavily Jewish, but, a large Irish population.
So did you hide it, being a Jew, a little bit?
Not really. I mean, we got chased by a mob once, and we'd have fights at our baseball games. That was a major thing. But, it was...
crazy.
It was a period, and that was the other thing that kept Roosevelt from... he was, once America got into the war, particularly, he was worried that, the accusation would be made that he was fighting the war for the Jews. And he didn't want to fan the anti-Semitism any more than he had to, so he tried to do some half measures.
So do you think in a way that he probably didn't promote Breckinridge to a higher position because of that?
I think it was a combination of things.
So so Roosevelt he was aware of his character, is what you're saying.
Yeah, and particularly some of the people on his staff. And he was not very efficient, they said.
Breckinridge or Roosevelt? Breckinridge.
Breckinridge, yeah. And he got a reputation when he was in Italy, which he later tried to overcome, of being pro-fascist or pro-Axis, and so he.
So it was true then.
He admired what Mussolini had done in Italy, and he spoke so, and he took a lot of grief for that. And then he began to recognize what Mussolini had done to the country, and he also openly talked about what a dictator he was. So. But he was a Southerner. He was, I guess there were a lot of strikes against him. And although he was in a position of power, he never got into a position of real power.
Right. That's what I'm feeling. He was he was impotent in a way but he hung out with powerful people.
Oh yeah, no, I mean he was. And he was part of the Roosevelt gang, and he was also, the reason he got in is he financed his way into Wilson's campaign, and he poured a lot of money into Roosevelt's campaign.
So he sort of maybe in a way bought his way into...
Yeah, I mean, but, he wasn't going to rise, and then Roosevelt had, Roosevelt didn't like the State Department at all.
I see. He didn't trust it?
Well, I didn't trust it. He thought there were a bunch of stuffed shirts. They were, they took forever to do anything. They were very obstructionist. And so
sounds like today.
Yeah.
Well, our State Department's not that.
No, the State Department's...
But it is obstructionist down in Washington.
The State Department's in good hands right now.
Yeah, we're in really good hands.
Yeah.
But I mean, in terms of the, obstructionist, the Congress being so obstructionist.
Yeah. Well,
in 2012.
Oh yeah, no. Oh, it's worse now because we forget Roosevelt had a Democratic Congress for most of the time. I think all of the time he was in.
Which is why he got such amazing things through. That's why he got so many wonderful programs through.
I mean, the Democrats from the South were very conservative, but not in some of the things that he was trying to do about the
social social network, the social net.
Because they got killed by the Depression, and it was the poorest part of the country. And so, I mean, when I have a thing in the book about it's taken from the local newspaper in Atlanta. When Roosevelt comes to Atlanta, and he's got the biggest crowd that ever assembled in the history of Atlanta. And, the people go wild. And Long was there, and he was one of the speakers, and so forth and so on. So, in any event, but he didn't rise. Roosevelt put in people that were closer to him, like Sumner Welles, his Undersecretary of State. He had a guy from Tennessee named Cordell Hull, who was Secretary of State. for most of the Roosevelt years.
And Hull was Hull, Hull?
Hull. And he was actually, his wife was part Jewish. And Hull was always the one that, where they said would, if Roosevelt didn't run, he would be the Democratic candidate. And but he was a namby-pamby.
You didn't like him?
Who, Hull?
Yeah.
Well, he didn't really have a lot of backbone.
Okay. He was a flipper?
Not openly, but he just didn't. He didn't push very hard, and he didn't take charge very strongly. Now, what happened was Roosevelt put his friend Sumner Welles in, and Sumner Welles had gone to Groton School. Like, he was part of the real inner circle, been an usher at Roosevelt's wedding, and so forth. And Welles was a very capable guy, very capable, but he had one little problem. He drank.
I was going to say, was he an alcoholic?
And worse, he was a homosexual.
Oh, dear.
And he got caught
with a
propositioning
page?
a Pullman porter.
Oh, gosh. Which must have been a black guy.
Yeah, of course. And some said he propositioned two of them.
Oh.
And that got out eventually. They kept it under wraps for about 3-4 years. And then it threatened to break, and it was leaked to the Republicans, and they were going to make a big deal. So
Roosevelt
resigned.
Oh, gosh.
And then Long thought, oh boy, this is my chance. I'll be the undersecretary. And he gave it, in fact, Roosevelt gave it to a Republican named Stettinius, who had been the head of General Motors.
So then was Breckinridge Long resentful of Roosevelt in the end of it, do you think?
Well, he was less resentful than he was hurt. Let me put it that way.
Yeah. Did it hurt their friendship irreparably?
Yeah, well, he stopped being invited to things.
Huh.
Then he became a kind of a, what do you call it?
Social outcast?
Well, no, I mean, he
a pariah?
became a problem to Roosevelt. What do you do with this guy? And so, and then he particularly became a problem and this was after the war started, and around 1943, the end of 43, beginning of 44, when Henry Morgenthau, who, and by this time they knew about the Holocaust. The first news came in 42. Long tried to suppress it as long as he could, but it got through. And then it was interesting. Morgenthau had 3 guys working for him. None of them Jewish. They were all Protestants, and they said, we got to do something about this. I mean, the Jews were being killed off wholesale, and we need to take this out of Long's hand, and have a new group formed to to work on it and try and save some of these people.
Oh
because
my
he wasn't
God.
saving anybody.
So he was buffering the president from the bad news and so that kept it going. So he kind of was a bad guy.
Who?
Long.
Oh yeah, no, he was.
I always wondered why it took so long for America to get involved.
Well, I mean, if I can digress for a minute, the title of my book is Breckinridge Long, an American Eichmann, with question marks.
Right. Okay.
And because in the long run, I put him in the same category.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Of a guy. I mean, Eichmann never said, "I never harmed a Jew in my life," and I mean,
that's like
they were doing their job.
And just like Condoleezza Rice won't admit that the Iraq War was a construct for the Defense Department or the defense industry to do well.
Oh, absolutely.
This was not about saving the Iraq people or saving America from terrorists.
They wanted to go to war.
They wanted the war because the industrial machine wanted to make money.
Sure.
And there's Cheney in the middle of it saying all of his concerns, Halliburton and whatnot. You know, it's really blood on their hands.
Oh yeah, they made a fortune out of that bastards. So anyway, where was I? That was just a digression.
So that's the title of the book is
Yeah.
Breckinridge, Eichmann question mark?
Yeah, Breckinridge Long, an American Eichmann.
Breckinridge Long, an American Eichmann. Yeah, of course.
And
so no wonder Roosevelt wanted to separate himself, and he knew there would be splashback.
Well, what happened was Morgenthau asked for a meeting with him, and he brought his 3 guys in. They had done a report, a really scathing report about what Long had done. And they had also started a movement. They had some congressional people who put in a bill to have this new agency come in, and Long was doing his best to kill it. And then Long made a fatal mistake. He went to Congress, a congressional committee, testified behind doors, and sort of, you know, very cleverly. I mean, he was a wily guy. He would get the committee to bottle it up, you know. And they had a convention about a conference about it, and which he held in Bermuda, so none of the media could get there, and came up with absolutely nothing, you know. But by this time, it was really causing Roosevelt some anguish. So they put it to Roosevelt that, you know, he had to get rid of him. He had to, and they wanted this new group, which was the idea of actually a guy from Maine. His name was Oscar Cox. Now, it's interesting. Oscar Cox's son was a good friend of mine.
Wow.
And he told me, and we did a book with him, an autobiography, after he got cancer and was on his way to a deathbed. But Peter said that he didn't know until the day of his father's funeral. His father was Jewish.
Wow.
And he came from a Portland Jewish family.
Is that crazy?
Yeah, it was just insane. And Peter was, you know, I just thought he was a kind of a Harvard, you know, type, and a very, very nice guy, and started a liberal newspaper here.
But he didn't know.
He didn't know.
Well, you know, you can understand. You know, people are being gassed.
Yeah, oh yeah.
People are being exterminated for being a Jew.
Oh yeah.
That's a lot of social pressure.
Well, it was, you know, it was very much in this country. My father changed his name, you know, because they had a very Jewish sounding name. And
can you imagine? They did the same. They didn't gas Africans, but they absolutely tortured and lynched and terrorized the African American. And there's nothing you can do to hide it.
Right.
You're just brown. There's no way, or black. There's no way to hide it.
Right.
And then, you know, what really gulls me about the Republican elite, and they're not all just Republicans, but what really breaks my heart about the elite upper class 0.001% that are mega wealthy is that if their relatives had to go through what the average black man's relatives had to go through, it's no wonder there wouldn't be parity. Like, there wouldn't be a level. It's never been a level playing field.
Of course not.
So for them to say there is a flaw in the African American race, you want to say the only flaw that ever existed was the day the African was traded into slavery in America, because from that point there, with the English Euro, you know, white American mindset that says, you know, that the black man was less than. You look at these guys now. I look at these white faces and the very wealthy, and I say, your relatives didn't have to deal with what the average black man's relatives had to deal with.
Unfortunately, a lot of those very wealthy people are Jewish now.
Yeah, not all of them though. There's still a lot that are, I mean, and a lot of those people, they own slavery, and a lot of those people were part of the Jim Crow, and a lot of those people, you know, we have blood on our hands.
South, I mean, of course, but even in the North.
And even today, there is still voter suppression, Neil. Can you
Absolutely.
imagine?
They're trying to bring back the
poll tax, yeah.
And no, it's just outrageous. But America was like that. I mean, and it wasn't just whites against blacks. There was Protestants against Catholics.
Right.
And Catholics were discriminated against. That's why most of them became Democrats, the same with the Italians. And we all faced that kind of, but it wasn't, in the case of the blacks in the South, they called them an inferior race so that they could use it for nothing.
Yeah.
And that just as the Nazis called the Jews inferior.
Yeah, it's crazy.
And then, that said, well, you just kill them. It doesn't bother, They're like
oh my
insects,
God, I know.
And, so anyway...
But the thing, though, I just want to say one more thing. The thing that is also sort of appalling, though, is that knowing that Roosevelt was the president and that one of his dear friends, really, had this disconnect, that he could suppress the knowledge and not do anything to help the extermination of a race of people.
Well, they didn't know that until this report came from the Treasury. Mm-hmm. Then they had it,
in black and white.
Like a law brief, They had, and I've got that in the book. I've got the parts of most of the actual report, and it was given to Roosevelt on a Sunday, and at the end of 1943, and then so Roosevelt said, "Okay, I will establish this group called the War Refugee Board by executive order," and which he did, and then they took away. Long's, they didn't kick him out of the State Department. They just took away his responsibilities for refugees and the rest of it. So, in fact, he stayed on. He was on the commission that designed the UN.
So they just basically made him more impotent within the...
Yeah, he just had less power, and he claimed, in his diary that he was happy to get rid of it, and he'd taken he'd gotten a lot of attacks on him, and he claimed they were all unfair, and he went back.
Were the attacks from the press or from socially?
From press and from Jewish groups, and there was a guy who came over. He was a Palestinian Jew, who came over and really got a group going to do something and try and save these people. And so
a Palestinian did that.
No, he was a Palestinian Jew. He was.
Yeah.
There was no Israelis then.
I always say that if you take Jews and Arabs and take their clothes off, you can't tell the difference. So if you take a Jew and an Arab and take their clothes off, how would you know?
It's the same thing with Serbs and Croats.
I know. How would you know? How would you know? So Neil, aside from being a historian, what inspired you to pick Breckinridge Long as a subject? Was there something about him being... What was it that was attractive other than the fact that there was all this material? Or?
Yeah, well, it was a combination of things. I'd been reading about this guy for years, and I said, who the hell is he, And I had a whole different idea. I thought he was some real, cranky old anti-Semite in a position of power in the State Department. But then I began, I began to read about him, and he was a much different kind of person. And I have the feeling that if they hadn't given him the visa thing, if they'd made him whatever he wanted to be, he would have never done any of this.
So, in other words, you think it might have kept his standing in a better light had he not had to be responsible?
He was ambitious, and and he was I don't know if you want to call him a social climber because he had plenty of money, and
but he was.
Yeah, he...
Hold on just a second, Neil. I'm going to give us a break. All right. Back to where we were. You can relax. You can sit back. Sure. How old were you when you first moved to Maine?
Let's see. We moved here in 62. So I was...
That's Carla speaking in the background.
What was I? I was 31 years old, I guess.
And you were you spent most of your time as a child in Brookline, Mass.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And how did you find York, other than being one of the prettiest places?
Well, actually, a friend of ours had moved up here, a classmate and friend had moved up here.
Who was that?
His name is Frank Musinski, and I had known him since he was since we were like 12 or 13, and he's a friend of Larry Alberts, who you met.
Yeah.
And so anyway, Frank moved up because his father died, and Frank came up. I'm trying to think. That was originally, yeah, I'm trying to get the chronology right. But he went to work, no, his father hadn't died at that point. He was working for his father, who owned a half interest in a shoe factory in South Berwick. And he didn't want to live in South Berwick, so he found a very nice place here in York Harbor. German refugees, actually. And so I came up and visited him. I always liked the place. And then later on, Frank went out to the movie school at UCLA, which I had applied to and been accepted, but my closest friend, Bert Bernstein, kept hacking me that I had to go to Columbia Journalism with him. So I did. I had applied to 3 graduate schools, one at Iowa, 2 for creative writing. But so I chose Columbia. But in any event...
Did you get into all the schools you applied to?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And no, because I graduated cum laude from Yale. That was a fairly prestigious thing. So anyway, Frank went out and he went to the movie school there. He met a very pretty blonde woman who was, again, she was the daughter of refugees from Germany, but they were non-Jewish. They had been left-wingers. Well, they was actually in the Max Reinhardt. Had worked for him. They were actors and actresses. And so her Bonnie's father he did character actors. He played Nazi officers. And they were very, very anti-Nazi. And then Mala, his wife, she ran a business, export business.
And so that's how you found yourself in Maine.
Yeah, because what happened was Frank. This is the long story. Frank called me one day and he said he'd been working with a director named Douglas Sirk. And Sirk was the only director that Lana Turner would work with.
Right.
And they were going to do a project based on the life of, what the hell was her name? Maurice Utrillo's mother, but she was and Renoir's mistress. I can't think of her name right now. And there's a biography of her, and he was going to make a movie, and Lana was going to play her part. And Frank called and he said, well, Sirk doesn't like the script. He said, why don't we get together and we'll do what do you call it?
A rewrite.
No, well, what you do first of
Oh,
all.
a pitch, like a treatment.
Treatment, that's the word I was looking for. So we would do a treatment. And so I flew out to Los Angeles, where he was living. We worked on it. Frank was a very difficult guy to work with. To get him, he was a brilliant writer, but you'd get him to do anything, it was like worth your life. So, so anyway,
that's where you met Carla, right?
Yeah, and he said, well, I got to go up to San Francisco this weekend. Why don't you come up with me? And he said, we can go look up Larry Williams, who was a classmate from Yale, an old friend of mine. And we'll have a good time up there. And I said, sure, great, let's go. So we went, and Larry was working in the same place that Carla was, Larry Williams. So we met with Larry, and I think by that time he was married, and Carla and Frank and myself, and that was it. That's all she wrote. 3 weeks later, we decided to get married.
Is that crazy? That's so cute.
Anyway, and then, you see, then what happened was Cirque had a heart attack.
Yeah.
The movie project was...
And he was gay.
Was he?
Yeah, very.
Oh, really? Well, he was
flaming
married.
Gay.
He was married, but his wife wouldn't let him continue.
Making films?
Yeah, they were over in Switzerland when it happened.
He was married?
Yeah.
Wow.
And
well, maybe he wasn't gay. I shouldn't say he was gay, but his films are very gay.
Oh, that might be, yeah.
I mean, maybe he was gay, but he was married and he wasn't happy, and he...
Well, you know, a lot of gays married to camouflage. And,
yeah.
I never met the man, but... So anyway, when that happened, Frank sort of tossed in the towel and went to work for his father at the shoe factory. And
here? In Berwick?
In South Berwick. And he moved into a really nice place along the river here in York called River House, and brought the kids. By that time, I think they had 2 kids. They eventually had 3. And so he, and then his father died, and he took over the plant, or they sold it. And then he was, I urged him to stay in Maine and put his money into a shoe factory here, and he wanted to go to Puerto Rico. They were going to do a lot for him, so he went to Puerto Rico. It was a disaster. And so then he went back to Boston and went to work for a big shoe company.
Oh.
So, but anyway, we had during this period, we were living in Boston, Carla and I, and we spent every weekend up here. So, then Carla got pregnant with our first child, and...
you found this house, right?
What?
You found this house.
This was before. We lived in another place. We lived down by the beach, Harbor Beach. We had the top 2 floors of a big building that's still there, and we had 8 or 9 rooms, paying the same amount we had for this tiny place in Boston. So,
wow!
And a block and a half from the ocean. So it was a great move. And then eventually, when we got up to our 3rd child, there was no room, there was no land around it. So we bought this house and fixed it up. So that's how I came here.
Wow. Now, when you were down in Washington, you were getting the Breckenridge Long information. Is that what you were doing last year?
Yeah,
when you went down to the Library of Congress.
Yeah, it's they call it the Madison Building. They have all the papers and stuff there.
And anybody can go, right? You just sign up?
Yeah, you have to, when you go, you have to get an ID card. So they photograph you, and I still have it. It's probably expired. I know I had to renew it once. And then you just use it.
Yeah.
Now, they have very strict rules. When you go in to use it, you put all your clothes and stuff in a locker. You use only the paper they give you, and only pencil to take notes with. I mean, you can get stuff Xerox.
Well, just so you don't damage the original materials.
Right, exactly.
And you have to wear gloves?
Yeah, some of this stuff is very valuable. And so, and then they check your papers before they let you out at night. So it's but then I also lucked out. I gave a talk down there to the Maine Society about one of my books. And the number 3 guy at the National Library was a guy from Maine, Charles Stanhope.
Oh, that's nice.
Yeah, now who retired and moved up to me. I see him from time to time.
I met Obama recently.
Yeah, well, I heard all about it.
It's pretty fun.
Yeah, I'll bet you were really on cloud 9.
Well, I just couldn't believe you recognized me.
Wow, that's amazing.
It was nice. It was very nice. But also I thought he was pretty impressive as an orator, and I think that he does, I like that he does, I believe him when he speaks. I feel like he's not trying to get me to love him or to like him. I feel like he's just believing what he believes. And even though I'm sure there is a little bit of, please like me, I want to be president again. For some reason, when I listen to Romney, I get the sense of almost like a pathological need to win and to be president, irregardless of the fact if he's right for the job. I don't know why I feel this way with Romney, but I feel like he's very much desperate to win the presidency. Not as a matter of course that he has.
What he wants to do for the people.
I don't feel any sense of us and what he wants to do for. I really get a sense, and it could be a wrong judgment, but I do feel like Romney doesn't care about anyone.
I don't think so. I think they've now got this worship of individualism, the Ayn Rand crap.
And she was a Russian Jew who hated herself. I mean, basically.
Yeah. And
I don't think she would have even liked Paul Ryan.
Oh my God, she'd have hated all what they're doing.
Yeah. Isn't that ironic?
Yeah.
Isn't that the way it works? It's crazy. Well, Neil, I think we're good. I think I have about an hour of this, and what I'll do is I'll put it together, and then I'll send it to you.
Is there anything else you need to know, or about all the other books, or?
Well, I think the two books, the two titles that you've just...
Yeah, they're coming out.
So give us the name again, just so that the viewers and listeners can...
Well, one is called, and I don't think there'll be many people in California who know York, Maine. There'll be a few, but York is Living History.
Okay.
And that's a rewrite. And it's a small book.
How many books in total have you written?
I kind of lost track, about 15, I think, that have been published. I mean,
so let's see what else. Well, the idea that you worked with Doug Sirk as a director is incredible. I mean, not many people know who Doug Sirk is, but Todd Haynes, who is a very famous current director and happens to be also homosexual, he did a movie with Dennis Quaid and Julianne Moore called and Dennis Haysbert called, I think it's called Somewhere or September. It's a very strange, but it was an homage to Douglas Sirk. And it's about a father who's married, who's homosexual. And Dennis Quaid plays the father, and he ends up going to bars and stuff. And back in the 50s, it was illegal, and you could be arrested and lose your job. And it's really done in the era of Doug Sirk, where it was just high production value, a lot of Technicolor. I can't remember the name of the film. Anyway, I find it interesting that you wrote a treatment for Doug Sirk.
Yeah, and the ironic thing was he liked it.
Yeah. But now he died promptly after the treatment and went...
No, he had a heart attack.
Oh.
And his wife had been trying to get him to stop working.
Okay. Well, there you go.
And once he wasn't going to do it, Lana Turner pulled out, and the project never got...
That happens.
It never happened.
Yeah.
I'll remember the name of the woman one of these days. But I also worked in motion pictures.
What did you do?
I was a screenwriter for a guy named Louis de Rochemont.
I don't know who that is. No, that doesn't mean he wasn't important.
No, he won an Academy Award.
What did he win an award for? I mean, what did he win the Oscar for?
That was the first movie about the black situation.
Seriously?
Yeah, Lost Boundaries, I think.
Okay.
And it won the Academy Award. He's the guy that invented the March of Time.
Okay.
And then he went into feature films. Mm-hmm. And this one, it was about a family in New Hampshire, because this is where he came from, this area. I think he lived in Portsmouth or grew up in Portsmouth. And he died in York Harbor, actually.
He died in the harbor?
At the home there.
Okay.
But anyway, he was pretty. I was working at his tail end of his career. He was a difficult guy, but that movie was about a family growing up pretending to be white, and then it's
called Passing. They were trying to pass.
Yeah, passing, and then when the son happens to find out that he is black, even though he doesn't look it. And that's what the movie's about.
And it's been made.
Oh, it was an Academy Award.
And it's, oh my God, I've got it.
Probably around 1949.
What is it called? 1949, it's called?
Lost Boundaries.
Lost Boundaries, okay. I'm still trying to find your film that you had done with the CBC, Jonathan and David.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I want to find it. I want to find that. So I have to go to the archives, because I'm sure they have it.
Yeah.
Everybody saves everything. Did you know that? Somewhere something is everywhere. everywhere.
Yeah, no, that would be. I'd like to see it.
I bet you would.
I never saw it.
Yeah.
I mean, we did a staged reading in New York, and
Mm-hmm.
and I had an agent then, and I said, well, why don't you send it to
Do you remember the name of the theater you worked out of?
where?
Or where the theater was you did the staging?
It was at the New School.
Okay.
I was taking a class, and
At NYC?
yeah, well, the New School, whatever, in television writing, and Flora Rita Snyber or something. She was the teacher. She wasn't very good, and she worked with a couple of producers. So I did this thing, and they wanted me to produce it. So I put it together. I directed it. And, prior to that, I'd made movies at Yale too.
Oh. Who were your influences when you were growing up at Yale? Like when you were at Yale?
In the movies,
cinematically, yeah.
In the movies, it was it's a Russian director, Battleship Potemkin.
Oh, right. What was his name? Some of the best, hottest directors right now are Russian.
Oh yeah, no, I mean
that we're working with now in Hollywood.
Oh, really?
The guy who directed Wanted, I can't remember his Tabor. I think his name is Tabor Valashvili or something. Fantastic. He did the Angelina Jolie film, and he did a movie called Night Stalker, I believe, or The Night Taxi, about vampires in Moscow, about 5 years ago, that were amazing. It's a trilogy, and it's super good. So some of the top directors right now in the industry are Russian.
Yeah, what the hell is the guy's name? He wrote books, and he did Alexander Nevsky. Oh God, I'm getting old.
But you decided that you would just be a writer and a historian, and when you moved to York, do you feel like because you were out of the city and making babies and getting into politics, did your focus change because you became more political?
Yeah, no, I always thought I was going to go into the motion picture business, and then I got my job with de Rochemont through a friend of mine named Jim Goldstone, and his father was an agent in Hollywood. Jim grew up in Hollywood, and his father discovered Elizabeth Taylor, who lived next door.
Okay.
Jim was her first boyfriend.
Oh, how cute.
And Jim, I met him, he went to Dartmouth, and he was a very good friend of Bert Bernstein, so, and I spent a lot of time at Dartmouth, and then Jim and I became good friends, and so when I went out there to work with Frank, and then we had the whole thing, Jim came to our wedding, and he wanted me to stay and work with him in TV and so forth, and I just didn't want to do it.
Yeah.
I just,
Too many of your friends and family here? Is that what it was, or?
No, it was just, I didn't like the atmosphere.
You didn't like
I didn't like when I worked in New York, I got a taste of it. Mm-hmm. A lot of phonies, a lot of disappointments, nothing much being done that was good, or at least that I could see. I had one friend I worked with there named Michael Romer, who did a movie again about a black, and he got a lot of attention with that. Mm-hmm. Michael was always writing script. He was a German refugee. I don't know if he's still alive. But so I was in and out of this kind of crazy world, and then, being friendly with Leonard Bernstein's brother, I went to a lot of parties there, and saw a lot of actors and actresses, and they.
At the end of the day, I wonder if, I think ultimately, I was talking to Michelle today, and she's on an A-list project, working with a giant budget, but she still has no time. She's still crunched. She says, Radon, it's not better. No matter what level you're at, it's just still difficult. So at the end of the day, I think that Hollywood or showbiz, the myth is a myth. It's a myth.
Oh, cool.
It's kind of a torturous, it's a grind. And I think it's far more, satisfying to do what you've done. I think you've made the right choice, Neil.
Well, yeah, and then I got sick of it, actually.
We're done. Here, okay. Wait, look in the camera. Neil, thank you so much for speaking to me. Just one second. We're done because
The souffle is ready.
but we're losing light and it's dinner time. Thank you so much for speaking
No,
to
you
me.
can have souffle.
All right. Bye.
Okay.